I don't know your face, I don't know your voice, but I've built you a kitchen with a window that faces the mountains, a reading corner by the fire, and a chair on the porch that has been empty for a year waiting for you." Ethan Walker wrote those words to a woman in Boston he had never met, never spoken to, never seen. Then he folded the letter, walked out to the unfinished house he had been building alone in the Montana wilderness, picked up his hammer, and kept going. Because some men don't wait for love to arrive before they prepare a place for it. And some women, when they finally read those words, stop breathing for a moment. If this story moves something in you, subscribe to our channel and stay until the very last word. And leave a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. The advertisement had been Margaret Hayes' idea. Ethan would never have done it on his own. He was not the kind of man who asked for things. He had spent the better part of his adult life learning not to want what he couldn't build with his own two hands, and a woman was not something a man could build. A woman was something a man had to deserve. And Ethan Walker, somewhere in the deep, honest part of himself that he rarely showed anyone, was not entirely sure he did. But Margaret had sat across from him at his kitchen table one October evening, poured herself a cup of his terrible coffee, and said, "Ethan, you are 38 years old. You have 300 acres, 300 head of cattle, and not a single person to eat dinner with. That is not living. That is surviving." "I do fine," he said. "You do fine," she repeated back to him, and the way she said it made the words sound like the saddest thing in the world. Margaret Hayes was 62 years old, had buried 2 husbands, raised 4 children, mostly alone, and had the kind of wisdom that came not from books, but from loss. She had been Ethan's nearest neighbor for 20 years. She had known him since before his mother died, since before the woman he loved left him, since before he closed the door on the softer parts of himself and decided loneliness was simply the price of staying in one place. "I've been fine," he said again. "There is a difference between fine and whole," Margaret told him, "and you know it." He didn't answer. He looked out the kitchen window at the land he had shaped with his hands over 15 years, the fences he had rebuilt 3 times after bad winters, the barn he had raised alone, after fire took the first one, the fields that fed his cattle through seasons that tried every year to break him. He had built all of it. He was proud of it, and it was completely, utterly silent. "I'm not good at being with people," he finally said. "You're good at being with me," Margaret replied. "You're different." "Why?" He thought about it. "Because you don't need anything from me." She was quiet a moment. Then she said, "Ethan, every person needs something from the people around them. The question is whether the right person makes that feel like a burden or a privilege." He didn't have an answer for that, so he poured more coffee and looked at the darkness outside and thought about what it would mean to stop surviving and start living. 3 days later, he asked Margaret to help him write the advertisement. The newspaper in Boston was called The Eastern Correspondent, and it carried a modest column in its weekend edition called Frontier Matrimonials. Margaret explained this to Ethan with the kind of matter-of-fact practicality she applied to everything, as though placing an advertisement for a life partner was as reasonable as ordering seeds from a catalog. "People do this all the time," she said. "Good women and good men who simply haven't found each other through ordinary means. And they're not," Ethan searched for the word, "desperate. Sometimes desperate people are the wisest ones," Margaret said. "They've already tried everything else." They spent 2 evenings writing it. Ethan kept making it too short. Margaret kept making it too formal. They argued mildly the way people argue when they genuinely respect each other and simply disagree. The final version read, "Montana Ranch Owner. 38 years seeks a woman ready to build a real life in the West. This is not a wealthy offer. I cannot promise ease or luxury. What I can promise is honesty, hard work, and a home where your voice will matter as much as mine. I am not looking for someone to serve me. I am looking for a partner. If you have courage and want something true, write to Ethan Walker, Silver Creek Valley, Montana Territory." Margaret read it twice and said, "It sounds like you." "Is that good?" he asked. "It's the best thing it could be," she said. He sent it off on a Tuesday morning standing at the post office window, while the postmaster, a heavy-set man named Grover, looked at the envelope with barely concealed curiosity. "Advertisement?" Grover asked. "Letter," Ethan said flatly. Grover nodded with a smile that said he knew exactly what it was. By the time Ethan rode home, he had already convinced himself that no one would respond. He was wrong. 11 women wrote to him. He was not prepared for that. He had expected perhaps 2, perhaps none. He sat at his kitchen table with 11 envelopes in front of him and felt something uncomfortably close to panic. He read them all. Some were kind, some were practical. One woman sent a detailed list of her domestic qualifications as though she were applying for a position rather than a life. 2 letters made him feel vaguely sad in a way he couldn't name, and one made him feel nothing at all. And then there was the letter from Clara Whitmore. It was 3 pages long, written in a neat, compact hand that suggested someone who had spent a great deal of time writing things that needed to be clear. She began not by describing herself, not by listing her qualities, but with a single sentence that stopped Ethan completely. Mr. Walker, I don't know if your house exists, but I know what it feels like to build something alone. He set the letter down. He picked it up again. He read the sentence 3 more times. Then he made fresh coffee and read the rest. Clara Whitmore was 27 years old and lived in Boston, where she had spent the past 6 years managing the financial accounts for her family's failing textile supply business. Her father was in declining health. Her 2 brothers had both left the city, one to New York, one to Chicago, neither of them particularly interested in the weight of the family name. Clara had stayed. She had taught herself bookkeeping from her father's old ledgers when she was 18, had taught herself contract law from borrowed books at the public library, had quietly become the reason the business had not collapsed entirely. She wrote all of this without pride. She wrote it the way someone reports weather factually, without needing it to mean anything beyond what it was. Then she wrote, I am not writing to you because I am desperate, though I understand if you assume that. I am writing because I read your advertisement twice, and both times I thought this is an honest man. And I have spent 6 years surrounded by men who were not honest, who said the right things and did the convenient things, and never once asked what I needed. I would rather live in a place I've never seen beside a man who tells me the truth than stay somewhere familiar surrounded by comfortable lies. And then, near the end of the 3rd page, I should tell you something that may end this correspondence immediately. I am not the kind of woman who becomes smaller to fit someone else's life. I have opinions. I argue when I believe I am right. I do not cook particularly well, though I am willing to learn. I manage money better than most men I have met. If you need someone quiet and agreeable, I am the wrong person. But if you need someone real, I might be exactly right. Ethan finished reading and sat in his kitchen for a long time without moving. Then he found a clean sheet of paper and wrote back. He told her the truth. That was the only principle he set for himself. Whatever he had hidden from other people, whatever smaller, more palatable version of himself he had offered the world, Clara Whitmore was going to get the real one. Because she had given him the real version of herself, he owed her the same. He wrote about Montana, about the winters that lasted so long a person started to wonder if spring was something they had imagined. About the cattle work, which was hard and physical and sometimes brutally discouraging. About the loneliness he had chosen and the loneliness that had chosen him, and the difference between the two. He wrote about his mother, who died of fever when he was 11. About his father, who kept going for 9 more years on pure stubbornness before his heart simply gave out. About the woman named Ruth, who he had loved at 25 and planned to marry, who looked at him one spring evening and said, Ethan, I care about you, but I cannot spend my life in the middle of nowhere, waiting for someone who loves his land more than he loves me. And she had left, and he had stood in the field where they used to walk together and understood slowly and painfully that she was not wrong. He had loved the land more. He just hadn't known it was possible to love both equally until he was alone enough to think clearly. He wrote, "I am not an easy man. I know that about myself. I have spent too long alone not to have strange habits and strong opinions and a stubbornness that my neighbor tells me is my worst quality. But I do not lie. I do not pretend. And I will never make you feel that your presence in my life is anything less than something I chose deliberately." He read the letter back to himself once. Then he sent it. The letters that followed built something. Ethan couldn't have named it exactly in the beginning. It felt like learning a person the way you learned a new piece of land slowly through repetition and attention, discovering which places were solid and which were soft, where the difficult terrain was, and where it opened unexpectedly into something beautiful. Clara wrote about her mornings in Boston, the walk to her father's shop before the city fully woke up the smell of paper and ink and old wood that she had grown up inside. She wrote about the ledgers she had reorganized 3 times because the old system made errors inevitable. She wrote about a particular argument she had won with a supplier who had tried to cheat her father's business, and the satisfaction of it. Not cruelty, just the clean, solid feeling of having been right and having proved it. She also wrote about things that cost her something to say. She wrote, "My mother died when I was 12. After that, I learned to need very little from other people, because needing things from people who are too tired or too gone to provide them is its own kind of punishment. I don't say this to make you feel sorry for me. I say it so you understand that if I seem independent to the point of stubbornness, it is not because I don't want help. It is because I taught myself long ago not to ask." Ethan read that paragraph and recognized something in it, the way you recognize your own reflection in unexpected water. He wrote back, "I understand that exactly. I think we were taught the same lesson by different teachers." And Clara wrote, "Maybe that is why we're writing to each other." In Silver Creek Valley, people noticed things. That was the nature of small towns. Not maliciously, mostly people simply paid attention to each other because there was not a great deal else to pay attention to. And what people noticed about Ethan Walker that winter was that something had shifted. He still rose before dawn. He still worked the cattle the same way with the same deliberate economy of movement that everyone in the valley recognized. He still ate dinner alone and rarely attended social gatherings and answered most questions with the minimum number of words required. But there were other things. He had started building. Not the fences and barns and practical structures that constituted his usual winter work. He was building a house. A real house with rooms that had purposes beyond sleeping and cooking, a reading corner beside the fireplace. A kitchen with a large window fitted to catch the morning light from the east. A wide front porch that faced the open land. And on the front porch, 2 chairs. Thomas Grady, who owned the feed store and had the gift of noticing everything while pretending to notice nothing, mentioned the chairs to his wife one evening. "2 chairs, he said. 2 chairs, she repeated. "Hasn't got but 1 person." "Not yet," she said. Word spread. The way that always did. Not announced, just absorbed, passed from household to household, the way weather moves through a valley. By February, most of Silver Creek Valley knew that Ethan Walker was building a house for a woman he had never met. The reactions were predictable. Some people found it romantic. These were mostly women of a certain age who had seen enough of life to understand that hope was not the same as foolishness. Some people found it baffling. These were mostly practical men who could not understand why you would invest the labor and material of building a home before you had confirmed the woman's existence to your own satisfaction. And some people found it ridiculous. James Caldwell's son Thomas, who ran the largest cattle operation in the Northern Valley and had strong opinions about weakness in men, said at the saloon one Saturday night, "Walker's lost his mind. Building a palace for a ghost. She'll never come. And if she does, she'll take one look at this place and get back on the train." Several men laughed. Ethan was not present. He was at home reading a letter. The letter was shorter than usual. Clara's letters had a rhythm: 3 pages on her good weeks, 2 on her harder ones, and occasionally a brief note when things at the shop had been difficult enough that she didn't have much left for words. This one was brief. My father had an episode this week. The doctor says his heart is weakening. I am trying not to think about what that means for the future, and focusing only on what's in front of me. I apologize for the short letter. I will write more next week when I have steadier hands. Ethan read it 3 times. Then he went out to the half-finished house and worked until after dark. He didn't know exactly why building calmed him when he was worried. It had always been that way. When the world felt uncertain, the clarity of physical work, a board that fit where it was supposed to fit, a nail that went in straight, a joint that held, gave him something to hold on to. He couldn't fix Clara's father. He couldn't make the distance shorter or the letters faster. He couldn't do anything at all except be the man she was writing to. So he built. He built the reading corner with particular care that night. He fit the shelves the way Clara had described, wanting them low enough to reach without standing wide enough for books to be stacked horizontally if that's what she preferred. He didn't know what she preferred, but he left room for either. The next morning he wrote back, "Take as long as you need. I'm not going anywhere." Spring came slowly that year, the way it always did in Montana, reluctantly, with false starts and late frosts that killed things you had begun to trust would survive. Ethan watched the land change the way he always did, with the combination of respect and frustration that the territory required. You could not rush spring in Montana. You could only work and wait. He was good at working. He was learning again how to wait. The house reached a point in late April where it was structurally finished. The roof held. The walls were solid. The floors were laid and the windows were fitted, and the kitchen had a proper iron stove that had taken 3 men to move into place and caused Ethan to say things he would have apologized for if anyone had been listening. Margaret Hayes came to see it on the first warm Saturday of the season. She walked through every room without speaking. She ran her hand along the kitchen windowsill. She stood in the reading corner for a long moment. She went out to the porch and sat in one of the 2 chairs and looked out at the land. Ethan stood in the doorway and waited. Finally, Margaret said, "Ethan Walker, this is the most honest thing you have ever built." He looked at his boots. "It's just a house," he said. "No," Margaret said quietly. "It is an argument. Every board in it is you telling the world, I believe someone is coming. I believe someone is worth this. I believe I deserve to stop being alone." She looked at him. Most men your age would never be brave enough to make that argument out loud. "I haven't made it out loud," he said. "I've barely told anyone." "You've built it," Margaret said. "That's louder." Say, the letter arrived in May. It was longer than usual. Clara's writing was more careful than normal, more deliberate, as though she had written it, and then rewritten it, and then written it again. She had made a decision. Her father's condition had stabilized, not improved, but stabilized. He had 2 nephews in the city who had agreed after considerable persuasion to take on the business accounts. A bookkeeper Clara had trained over the past 2 years was capable of managing the daily work. She was not abandoning her father, but she was not. She had decided going to abandon herself either. She wrote, "I am 27 years old, and I have spent 6 years keeping something alive that may not survive anyway. And I realized recently that there is a version of my life where I keep doing exactly this until there is nothing left of me that belongs to me. I don't want that version. I want a life that is also mine. And then, Mr. Walker, I would like to come to Montana, if that offer is still open." Ethan read the letter sitting on the front porch in his chair, the empty chair beside him. He sat there for a while. Then he went inside and wrote the shortest letter of their entire correspondence. "Miss Whitmore, the offer has never been more open. Come whenever you're ready. The house is finished. The chair is waiting. Ethan." Can't. She wrote back 3 weeks later. She was coming. In 8 weeks. On the train from Boston to Billings, and then south to Silver Creek Valley. She included a detail that Ethan did not expect: a small pressed flower from a garden her mother had planted before she died, tucked between the pages of the letter. "I don't know why I'm sending you this," she wrote. "I suppose I want you to have something from the life I'm leaving before you meet me in the life I'm choosing. Ethan looked at the small dried flower for a long time. Then he put it carefully on the shelf in the reading corner of the house he had built for a woman he had never met. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Ethan Walker was afraid. Not afraid she wouldn't come. Afraid of what it would mean if she did. Because he had spent 8 months writing to a woman on paper, and paper was something he was good at. Paper didn't require him to sit across a dinner table and make conversation. Paper didn't require him to be anything in real time in real space in the unpredictable present. A real woman in a real house was something else entirely. He went to Margaret's that evening and sat at her kitchen table and said nothing for almost 10 minutes. Margaret watched him and waited. Finally, she said, "She's coming. In 8 weeks. And you're terrified." "I'm not—" He stopped. Margaret tilted her head. "I don't know how to be with someone," Ethan said. "Not day after day. Not in all the ordinary minutes. I know how to write her. I know how to build her a house. But to actually—" He stopped again. "What if I'm better in letters than I am in person?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Ethan, do you know what she'll find when she arrives? A man who wrote to her honestly for 8 months. A man who built her a kitchen with the window facing the mountains because she mentioned once that she missed seeing open sky. A man who put up bookshelves before he'd ever asked if she liked to read because he'd been paying close enough attention to her letters to know." She leaned forward. "You've been being yourself for 8 months in those letters. Don't stop now just because she's going to be standing in front of you." He looked at the table. "What if she's disappointed?" he asked. "Then she'll tell you," Margaret said simply. "And you'll figure it out. That's what 2 honest people do." He went home and sat on the porch in his chair until midnight. The Montana sky above him was enormous, and absolutely indifferent the way it always was, the way he had sometimes found comforting and sometimes found crushing. 8 weeks. He had 8 weeks to become the man he had been pretending he already was. Or maybe, and this was the thought that kept him on the porch longer than anything else, maybe he already was that man. Maybe he had been that man all along. Maybe that was the thing Clara Whitmore had seen in a single sentence of an advertisement in a Boston newspaper. The thing she had kept writing back to for 8 months. The thing she was crossing hundreds of miles to find. He looked at the empty chair beside him. 8 weeks. The house was ready. He was almost ready. And somewhere in Boston, a woman he had never met was packing 2 old suitcases and walking toward a life she had chosen with her eyes open. 8 weeks. Ethan had thought that was enough time to prepare himself. He was wrong. The first week after Clara's letter arrived, he worked the ranch with the kind of furious productivity that his hired hand, a 22-year-old named Pete Dawson, found alarming. Pete had worked for Ethan for 3 years, and knew his rhythms the way a man learns weather by paying attention to the signs. And the signs that week were unmistakable. Ethan fixed every fence post on the north side of the property. He repaired the barn roof. He reorganized the entire tool shed, which had not been organized since Pete could remember, and possibly not since before that. He split enough firewood to last 2 winters. He rode the full perimeter of the property twice in a single day, which Pete had never seen him do, and came back in the evening with the expression of a man who had been arguing with himself the entire time, and hadn't won. On Friday, Pete finally asked, "Something happened?" Ethan unsaddled his horse and didn't answer immediately. "Woman's coming," he said finally. Pete waited. "The one from the letters?" "Yes." "When?" 7 weeks. Pete absorbed this. He was a young man who had grown up in a large, chaotic family, and understood instinctively that some information required more response than others. This information required careful handling. "That's good," Pete said. "Is it?" It wasn't a question. Pete recognized that too. "Isn't it?" he asked carefully. Ethan hung the saddle on its peg and looked at the barn wall for a moment. "I've been writing to this woman for 8 months," he said. "Every week. Sometimes twice a week. I have told her things I haven't told anyone alive." He paused. And now she's going to arrive. And I am going to have to be in person, the man she has been writing back to. Pete considered this. You're worried you're not that man. I'm worried I'm better on paper than I am standing in front of someone. Pete thought about it with the earnestness of someone who hadn't yet learned to pretend things were simpler than they were. Mr. Walker, he said finally. I've worked for you 3 years. You're not easy. You don't talk much. You don't explain yourself much. You expect a lot and you don't always say thank you when you should. He paused. But you're honest, all the way through. I've never once heard you say something you didn't mean. He picked up his own saddle. If that's what you put in those letters, then you haven't been lying to her. You've been telling her the truth, and she's still coming. Sigdinaeko. Ethan looked at him for a long moment. When did you get wise? He said. I learned from watching you, Pete said, and walked out of the barn before Ethan could answer. Chaw. The second week, Ethan went back to the house. He walked through every room the way he imagined Clara would, trying to see it the way someone who had spent her life in a Boston City apartment would see it. He looked at the kitchen and tried to decide if the stove was positioned sensibly for someone who hadn't grown up with one like it. He looked at the reading corner and wondered if he had put the shelves at the right height. He stood in the main bedroom in the mid-morning and tracked the light across the floor and thought about whether the east-facing window would be welcome or intrusive to someone who might want to sleep past sunrise. He was so deep in these calculations that he didn't hear Margaret come in. You're in here measuring imaginary problems, she said from the doorway. He turned around. I'm checking the house. You've checked it 4 times this week. She crossed her arms. Ethan, the house is perfect. Stop fixing it and start thinking about yourself. What about myself? When is the last time you had a conversation with another human being that lasted longer than 10 minutes? He opened his mouth and closed it. Not counting letters, Margaret added. He thought about it honestly and realized with something between amusement and alarm that the answer was probably Margaret herself, and that had been 2 weeks ago. I work alone, he said. You live alone, she corrected. There's a difference, and Clara Whitmore is coming here to live with you, not to receive your correspondence, to live with you, to eat breakfast across from you, to hear the way you sound when you're tired or frustrated or happy, to be in the same room as you when neither of you has anything particular to say. She held his gaze. Are you ready for that? I don't know, he said honestly. Margaret nodded slowly. Good, she said. That's the right answer. The men who say they're ready never are. The men who admit they don't know are the ones who actually figure it out. She walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the land. I want to tell you something, she said, quieter now. My first husband, when I arrived here, I was 20 years old. I had never been west of Ohio, and I was standing in a house that was honestly worse than this one by a considerable distance. And I looked at him across that kitchen, and I thought, I have made a terrible mistake. She paused. I thought that for about 3 weeks. And then I stopped thinking it because he was honest and he was kind and he showed up every single day. Not perfectly, but consistently. She turned back to Ethan. That's all it is in the end, showing up consistently. Can you do that? Yes, Ethan said. That at least he was certain of. Then you're more ready than you think. The third week, a letter arrived from Clara. Not about her travel plans. Not about arrangements or timing. Just a letter, the kind she wrote when something was on her mind, and she needed to say it to someone who she trusted to hear it without flinching. She wrote about her father. He had been worse that week. Not dangerously, but noticeably slower in his speech, less steady on his feet, tired in a way that went past ordinary tiredness into something that lived in the bones. The doctor had come twice. The verdict was the same as it always was. The heart was weakening and there was little to be done except manage it carefully and hope. I sat with him last night after the shop closed, she wrote. He asked me if I was doing the right thing, going west, and I told him yes. And he looked at me for a long time, and then he said, Clara, you've been taking care of other people your whole life. It's time someone takes care of you. He's never said anything like that to me before. He's not a man who speaks in sentiment. I had to leave the room so he wouldn't see me cry. And then, I don't tell you this to make you feel responsible for any of it. I tell you because you are the person I talk to now. You have become that person without either of us deciding it, and I thought you should know that I notice it, that I'm grateful for it. Ethan read the letter twice. Then he walked out to the porch and sat in his chair for a long time, the Montana afternoon spreading out in front of him in every direction, and thought about what it meant that a woman in Boston had decided he was the person she talked to. He thought about Ruth, who had left. About how in the years after he had told himself the lesson was not to become the person someone else depended on. Because people left, and what they took with them when they went was the part of you that had trusted them. He had lived by that lesson for 13 years. And now Clara Whitmore was sitting in a city he had never visited beside a father whose heart was failing writing to him because he was the person she talked to. He went inside and wrote back immediately. Miss Whitmore, what your father said to you is true, and I want to say something I probably should have said more clearly before. You are not coming to Montana to be taken care of in the way that diminishes a person. You are coming because you deserve a life that is also yours. Those are different things. You have made yourself indispensable to everyone around you for years. I am not asking you to do that here. I am asking you to build something alongside me. That is not the same as carrying everything alone. Dis-moi sera discipliné. He sent it the next morning and spent the rest of the day wondering if he had said too much. Her answer came 10 days later. Mr. Walker, that is the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me. Don't apologize for it. He hadn't apologized, but he was glad she anticipated that he might want to and told him not to. The fifth week brought trouble from a direction Ethan had not expected. Thomas Caldwell came to his property on a Tuesday afternoon. Thomas was 34 years old, the son of the largest landowner in the Northern Valley, and had grown up with the unchallenged assumption that what he wanted, he would eventually have. He was not cruel exactly. Ethan had always thought cruelty required a kind of intention that Thomas lacked. Thomas simply moved through the world with the confidence of a man who had never been told no by anything that mattered. He was handsome and well-dressed, and spoke with the easy authority of someone who had never needed to earn it. He rode up to where Ethan was working on the east fence line and stopped his horse. Walker. Ethan kept working. Caldwell. Heard you've got a woman coming. Did you? Town's talking about it. Town talks about everything, Ethan said. Thomas was quiet a moment. Ethan kept his attention on the fence post. I wanted to offer you some friendly advice, Thomas said. Ethan straightened up and looked at him. Thomas had a particular expression that people wore when they were about to say something they'd prepared in advance, but wanted to appear spontaneous. Go ahead, Ethan said. Mail-order arrangements don't usually work out, Thomas said. The women who come west that way, they're not built for this life. They get here, they see what it actually is, and inside 6 months they're gone. Sometimes less. He paused. I've seen it happen twice in this valley alone. Ethan looked at him steadily. Is that the advice? The advice is don't put everything you've got into something that's likely to fall apart. Ethan held the fence post in both hands and thought very briefly about what he wanted to say and what he was actually going to say. Thomas, he said finally, I appreciate you riding out here, but I didn't ask for your assessment of my situation, and I don't recall us being close enough for you to offer it unsolicited. Thomas's jaw shifted slightly. I'm just saying. I know what you're saying, Ethan said. What you mean is that you don't think I should believe in this. And what I'm telling you is that I don't require your permission to believe in anything. He went back to the fence post. You have a good afternoon. Thomas sat on his horse for another moment. Then he turned and rode away without another word. Ethan drove the next fence post in harder than it needed to go. He told Margaret about it that evening. She listened without interrupting, which was her way when she was paying close attention. When he finished, she asked, what did he actually want? Ethan thought about it. I'm not sure. Think harder. Ethan considered it. Thomas Caldwell's family had been trying to expand their land holdings in the valley for years. Ethan's property sat at a junction that would give the Caldwells access to the eastern water rights, something Thomas's father had mentioned carefully and indirectly twice in the past 3 years. He wants the land, Ethan said slowly. He wants you to fail, Margaret said, which is not the same thing, but it gets him to the same place. If she comes and leaves you fall apart, you sell. He's seen that story before somewhere, and it worked. She looked at Ethan directly. Don't give him the story. I wasn't planning to. Then here's the other piece, she said. When Clara arrives, Thomas Caldwell will be polite to her face and undermine her behind her back. He'll make sure she hears every story of women who couldn't survive this life. He'll make sure she understands very subtly that the valley doesn't quite believe in her yet. He's good at that kind of thing. She leaned forward. Make sure she knows who he is before he gets the chance to introduce himself. Ethan nodded slowly. I'll tell her in the next letter. Good. And tell her something else. Margaret's voice shifted to something more careful. Tell her that there will be people here who don't want you to succeed, and that their opinion of her arrival is none of her concern. She needs to hear that from you before she hears anything from anyone else. He wrote it that night, not with alarm, not with the kind of warning that would frighten someone who was already crossing a continent on the strength of 8 months of letters. He wrote it plainly the way he wrote everything. There is a man in this valley who will be courteous to you in person, and who will work against us quietly in public. I want you to know this before you arrive, so that nothing he says or implies catches you off guard. His name is Thomas Caldwell. He wants my land. He does not want us to succeed because our success inconveniences him. I'm telling you this not to alarm you, but because you told me you'd spent 6 years dealing with men who weren't honest. I don't want to be one of them, even by omission. Clara's reply came back in 2 weeks. Mr. Walker, I have managed Thomas Caldwell's kind my entire professional life. Thank you for telling me. It changes nothing, except that I'll know to watch his hands when he shakes mine. Ethan laughed out loud when he read that. Alone in his kitchen, the sound of his own laughter startled him slightly, the way an unexpected thing always does when it's been absent long enough. He realized it was the first time he had laughed in months. The 6th week, 2 things happened. The first was that Pete Dawson asked with characteristic directness whether he should look for other work. Ethan was confused enough by the question that he stopped what he was doing. Why would you do that? Pete shifted his weight in that way young men do when they've been rehearsing something. Well, when she comes, if things change. I didn't want to just be in the way. Ethan looked at him for a long moment. Pete, you're the best hand I've had. I am not asking you to leave. But with a woman in the house? She's coming to be my partner, Ethan said. Not to rearrange the ranch. You've got a job as long as you want it. He paused. But I appreciate you asking instead of just worrying. Pete nodded, visibly relieved, and went back to work. The second thing was a longer letter from Clara than usual, written over the course of what she told him was 3 separate evenings. She was afraid. She didn't call it fear exactly. She called it uncertainty, which Ethan recognized as a braver word because it was more specific. I have made decisions my entire life by calculating what was necessary, she wrote. What was needed from me, what consequences followed from which choices, what the responsible path was. I have never made a decision primarily because I wanted to. This is the first time, and I find I don't entirely trust my own wanting because I have so little practice with it. And then, in the second evening's writing, what if I arrive and find that I've been writing to a version of you that the letters created? What if the real Ethan Walker, the one who exists in 3-dimensional space and has bad days and says the wrong thing at the wrong time and is difficult in ways I haven't imagined yet? What if that person is different from the one I've been trusting? Ethan read that paragraph with a chest that felt tighter than usual, because it was the exact question he had been asking himself about her. He sat with the letter for an entire evening before he answered. And when he wrote back, he wrote very carefully. Clara, the man in the letters and the man in real life are the same man. I want to promise you that. But here is something more honest. The man in the letters has had time to think before he responds. The man in real life won't always have that. He will sometimes say the wrong thing, not because he means the wrong thing, but because the words come out wrong before the thought has finished forming. He will be quieter in person than on paper, because that is the nature of him. And he will not always know how to show what he's feeling in the moment that he's feeling it. What I can promise you, the only thing I will absolutely promise, is that the values in the letters are real. The honesty is real. The intention is real. The rest you will have to give me time to show you. He sent it and then spent several days quietly terrified that he had said the wrong thing. But Clara's answer when it came did something unexpected. It came with a date. A specific date. The day she would board the train from Boston. The day she would arrive in Billings. And the day, a Saturday in late June, when she would step off the platform at Silver Creek Valley. And below the dates in her neat compact hand, I read your letter 3 times, Mr. Walker. Each time I trusted you a little more. I will see you in 22 days. 22 days. Ethan pinned the letter to the wall of his kitchen above the window that faced east and looked at it every morning. On the 21st day, the town found out she was coming. Not because Ethan announced it. He hadn't announced anything. But Grover at the post office had the particular skill of knowing things he had no formal way of knowing, and Silver Creek Valley had spent the better part of a year watching Ethan build a house, and sometimes communities simply decide that a piece of information belongs to everyone and acts accordingly. By midday, it was known. By evening, it was discussed. At the general store, a woman named Ellen Pratt said that it was romantic and brave, and that she hoped the young woman found everything she was looking for. At the saloon, Thomas Caldwell said that Walker was setting himself up for public humiliation, and that a Boston bookkeeper was going to last in the Montana territory about as long as a spring frost. At Margaret Hayes's house, Margaret sat in her kitchen and thought about a 20-year-old version of herself who had arrived in this valley with a trunk, a recipe book, and a husband she was still learning, and she allowed herself a feeling that was almost entirely hope. And at Ethan Walker's ranch, the man himself was sitting on the front porch in his chair. The empty chair beside him, the Montana night stretching out in every direction, thinking about a woman he had been writing to for 8 months, who would be standing on a train platform in 22 hours. He was not calm. He was not ready. But he was all the way through decided. He had built this house board by board in the cold and the heat and the doubt and the ridicule. He had written 200 pages of honest letters to a stranger. He had planted flowers he didn't know how to tend, because she had once mentioned loving them. He had built 2 chairs and left one empty for a year. He was done being afraid. She was coming, and whatever the next chapter of his life turned out to be difficult, surprising, imperfect, real, it was going to be written with someone else in the room. He looked at the empty chair one last time. Tomorrow, he told himself. Tomorrow, it wouldn't be empty anymore. The train was 40 minutes late. Ethan stood on the platform at Silver Creek Valley Station and did not move for the entire 40 minutes. He had arrived 20 minutes early, which meant he stood in the same spot for 1 hour total, watching the track disappear into the distance, listening for a sound that didn't come on schedule. Pete had offered to drive him in the wagon, and Ethan had said no. He needed to arrive alone. He needed, if he was honest about it, the 20-minute ride on horseback to settle himself to use the physical fact of movement to quiet the thing that had been happening in his chest since he woke up that morning at 4 in the dark and lay staring at the ceiling until it was reasonable to get up. He had dressed carefully. Not in his finest clothes. He didn't own fine clothes in any meaningful sense, but in his cleanest ones. His good shirt, the jacket he wore to the occasional church service Margaret dragged him to. He had shaved. He had combed his hair and immediately messed it up, running his hand through it and then tried again. Margaret had seen him leaving and said nothing except, "You look like yourself. That's exactly right." Now he stood on the platform and waited. 2 women from town were also there waiting for a supply delivery. They were polite enough not to stare at him directly, but Ethan was aware of being watched. Silver Creek Valley had been waiting for this moment almost as long as he had, and the community's investment in the outcome was something he could feel without anyone stating it. Grover from the post office materialized at his elbow at some point and said, "Train's running late out of Billings, weather north." "I know," Ethan said. "She'll still be on it?" Grover offered. "I know," Ethan said again. Grover nodded and drifted away with the sensitivity of a man who understood when his presence was not the comfort he intended. The 40 minutes passed, the way difficult time always does, in pieces that were alternatively too fast and too slow. The mind cycling between total blankness and a particular kind of overcrowded urgency that wasn't useful but couldn't be stopped. Ethan thought about Clara's first letter, the sentence about building something alone. He thought about every letter after that stacked in a wooden box on the shelf in the reading corner of the house, more than 60 letters, total 200 pages of a woman's voice becoming familiar to him. He thought about the pressed flour. He thought about the 2 chairs. He thought about Ruth, and then deliberately stopped thinking about Ruth. He was not doing this wrong. He was not about to make the same mistake. Clara Whitmore was not Ruth. He was not the same man he had been at 25, and this was not the same story. Then the train whistle came, and every thought in his head went completely silent. Oh, she was not what he had imagined. He didn't know what he had imagined exactly. The letters had given him her mind, her voice, her values, the shape of how she thought. What they hadn't given him was the physical reality of her, the way she moved, the expression on her face, the way she carried herself after 3 days on a train across a continent. She stepped off the second car carrying 2 suitcases that were clearly heavy, and she didn't wait for anyone to offer help. She shifted the grip on both handles and stepped down onto the platform, and then stopped. She looked at the town. She looked at the people. And then she looked at Ethan. He knew it was her because of the way she looked at him. Not with recognition exactly, she had never seen his face either, but with the particular attention of someone who had been given a description and was comparing it to reality with a quick, precise mind. He felt for one strange moment like a ledger being assessed. Then Clara Whitmore set both suitcases down on the platform and said, "You're taller than I expected." Ethan's chest, which had been compressed into something tight and complicated all morning, released. "You didn't ask about height in any letter," he said. "I didn't think to," she said. "I was asking about more important things." It was not a warm opening. It was not the moment he had tried and failed to rehearse. But it was honest and slightly funny and completely like everything she had written, and Ethan realized in the space of about 15 seconds that he was not disappointed. He walked to her suitcases and picked them both up. "Welcome to Silver Creek Valley," he said. She looked at him a moment longer. Her eyes were dark brown and direct in a way that reminded him of her letters, no preamble, straight to the substance of things. "Thank you for coming yourself," she said. "I wasn't certain you would." "Did you think I wouldn't?" "I thought you might send someone," she said. "Because you were nervous." He almost said he wasn't nervous. He stopped himself. "I considered it," he admitted instead. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, more like a small internal settling, the kind that happens when a person has been holding their breath without knowing it and finally breathes. "Good," she said. "I was nervous too. It's better if we're both nervous." He carried her suitcases to where his wagon was waiting. He'd borrowed it from Pete, after all, because suitcases on horseback were not practical, and she walked beside him, and neither of them spoke for the first 2 minutes, and it was surprisingly not awful. It was the kind of silence that exists between people who have already said a great deal, and don't need to fill every moment to prove the connection is real. Then she said, "Tell me one thing that wasn't in any letter." He thought about it. "I burned dinner twice this week trying to cook what you described in the letter from March." She turned her head to look at him. "The lamb stew. The lamb stew. And third attempt was acceptable," he said. "The first 2 were not something I want to discuss." This time she actually smiled. It changed her face in a way that was slightly startling, the way sunlight on familiar land looks different than you expect and better than you planned for. "Tell me one thing," he said. She didn't hesitate. "I cried on the train. Not from sadness. I wasn't even sure what it was. I looked out the window somewhere in Indiana and started crying and couldn't stop for about 10 minutes, and then it was over." "Were you afraid?" "No," she said. "I think I was relieved. I've been making responsible decisions for 6 years. Crying on a train felt like something that finally belonged just to me." Ethan absorbed that and said nothing because there was nothing to add to it. They drove toward the ranch, and Clara looked at the land around her, the mountains in the distance, the enormous reach of Montana sky, and he watched her face and tried to read what she was thinking. "It's bigger than I understood," she said finally. "The space." "Does it bother you?" "No," she said, and she meant it. He could hear that she meant it. "It feels like there's room to breathe." The first real difficulty happened within 48 hours. Not an argument exactly. A collision of two people's ways of being that happened the way these things always happen, not in the middle of something important, but in the middle of something entirely ordinary. Clara had asked to see his ranch accounts the second morning. She did it naturally, the way she might have asked to see any financial record she'd been asked to oversee, with straightforward professional curiosity. No apology, no extensive explanation. She was a bookkeeper. This was what she understood. She wanted to understand the financial foundation of the life she had agreed to build. Ethan handed her the ledgers without hesitation. It was what happened afterward that caused the problem. Clara spent an hour with the ledgers, and then came and found him in the barn and said, "You're losing $11 a month on the feed arrangement with Grover's supply store." He looked up from the saddle he was repairing. "The feed arrangement's been in place for 4 years. "I know. And for 4 years you've been paying 12% above the going rate, because the contract Grover wrote in 1880 had a price adjustment clause that automatically increases annually, and no one renegotiated it." She set the ledger on the workbench. "I can fix this in an afternoon." "I know about Grover's prices," Ethan said, and he heard his own voice come out slightly flatter than he intended. Clara heard it too. She looked at him steadily. "Then why haven't you addressed it?" "Because Grover is a decent man who has filled my orders reliably for 4 years, and $11 a month is not worth making an enemy." "That's not what the ledger says. The ledger says $11 a month for 4 years is nearly $500. "I know what the math is," he said. The silence between them had a different quality than the silence in the wagon. This one had weight to it. "Ethan," Clara said, and it was the first time she had used his first name, and they both noticed it. "I'm not criticizing how you've run this ranch. You've kept it solvent under conditions that would have broken other operations. I've read enough in these ledgers to know that." She paused. "But you asked me here to build something alongside you. That means letting me do what I know how to do." He set down the saddle repair and looked at her. She was standing straight, no apology in her posture, no attempt to soften the directness of what she'd said. This was the woman from the letters, exactly the woman from the letters. He took a breath. "All right," he said. "All right. Talk to Grover, but do it in a way that doesn't humiliate him." "I'm a bookkeeper, not a brawler," she said. "I know how to have a financial conversation without making it personal." "Then go ahead." She picked up the ledger. Then she stopped. "And Ethan, I'm sorry for coming in hard. I should have asked first, not told." He shook his head. "You were right. I didn't need an apology. I needed to hear it." He held her gaze. "We're figuring out how to do this. That's what this week is. Give me some grace when I get it wrong." "If you'll give me the same," she said. "Done," he said. She went to see Grover the next afternoon and came back with a revised contract and a somewhat stunned supply store owner who had apparently not encountered many women who knew what a price adjustment clause was, let alone could quote one from memory. Pete heard about it by evening and told Ethan with undisguised admiration. She went in there with nothing but a ledger and one piece of paper and came out with a better deal. I know, Ethan said. She's something, Pete said. I know, Ethan said again, and this time he allowed himself to mean it in every direction at once. The first Sunday Margaret Hayes came to dinner. This had been planned. Margaret had suggested it not to inspect Clara, she'd said firmly to Ethan, but to welcome her, which was a different thing entirely. Ethan had cooked badly, and then Clara had taken over without making a production of it, and what arrived on the table was considerably better than what had been in the pot 20 minutes earlier. Margaret ate and said, "You saved us from a grim meal." "He does something unusual with heat," Clara said. "Too high too early." "I have been telling him that for 15 years, Margaret said. Ethan looked between them. "I can hear you both." "We know," they said nearly simultaneously, and then looked at each other with the particular recognition that happens when two people realize they are going to understand each other very well. Over dinner, Margaret asked Clara about Boston, about her father, about the business. Clara answered all of it directly and without self-consciousness, the way she wrote accurately, without decoration, but not without feeling. At one point, Margaret asked, "Were you afraid of coming here?" "Terrified," Clara said. "But I've been making fear-based decisions for 6 years in the other direction. Staying because I was afraid to leave. I decided I'd rather be afraid in a new direction." Margaret looked at her for a long moment. "You're going to be fine," she said. "Not easy, but fine." "I don't need easy," Clara said. "I've never had easy." After dinner, Margaret caught Ethan alone in the kitchen for a moment and said very quietly, "She's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Someone softer, maybe. More uncertain." She shook her head. "She knows exactly who she is. Do you understand what a gift that is? Do you understand how rare that is?" "Yes," Ethan said. "Good. Don't waste it." The twist came at the end of the second week, and it came from a direction that blindsided Ethan entirely. A letter arrived from Boston, not from Clara's father, from her brother James. James Whitmore, who had left for New York 3 years ago and taken no interest in the family business since, had apparently decided now that Clara was no longer present to run things that the business represented a significant inheritance concern. He had hired a lawyer. The lawyer had written a formal letter asserting that the sale of certain business assets which Clara had authorized in order to pay for her father's medical care and fund her own travel west had been conducted improperly and were subject to dispute. In short, James Whitmore was coming after his sister from 800 miles away, claiming she had mismanaged money that was technically half his. Clara read the letter at the kitchen table. Ethan watched her face go through something complicated fury, then a cold stillness that was somehow more alarming than the fury, then a kind of exhausted recognition that said this was not entirely a surprise, only the timing of it. "My brother," she said. "I gathered. He hasn't corresponded with me in 14 months, she said. 14 months, while I was managing a failing business and paying our father's doctors." She set the letter down with a precise, controlled movement that suggested she was being very careful not to do something dramatic with it. "And now that I've left, now that I'm no longer available to carry the weight, he is suddenly deeply concerned about the financial management." "What can he actually do?" "Nothing legally," she said. "Everything I did was documented and authorized. I have 3 copies of every transaction I made signed and dated." She paused. "He knows that. His lawyer knows that. This isn't about the money." "Then what's it about?" She looked at Ethan directly. "It's about making sure I know he can reach me even here. It's about making me feel like I didn't actually get away." Her jaw was tight. "He's always done this. Every time I made a decision that had nothing to do with what he wanted, he found a way to make the consequences land on me." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Clara," he said, "do you have someone in Boston who can respond to that lawyer on your behalf?" "My father's old attorney. Yes. Send him a letter today. Give him everything he needs to shut this down. Then don't think about it again until you hear back." She looked at him. You make it sound simple. It's not simple, he said. But it's clear. You did nothing wrong. The documentation proves it. Your brother is throwing noise at you to see if you'll flinch. He held her gaze. Don't flinch. Something moved across her face. Not relief exactly, more like the feeling of having a wall at your back when you expected to be standing in the open. You're angry, she said. Yes. On my behalf. He has spent 14 months not caring about you, Ethan said. And now he's sending lawyers to make sure you remember he exists. Yes, I'm angry. Clara looked at him for a long moment. I need to say something, she said. And I need you to just hear it and not minimize it. All right. No one has ever been angry on my behalf before, she said. Not like that. Not with the kind of anger that says you actually matter enough to be worth defending. Her voice was steady, but her hands weren't entirely. I don't know what to do with that yet. But I wanted you to know I noticed it. Ethan didn't say anything for a moment. Then carefully, you're going to have to get used to it. She wrote to her father's attorney that afternoon. She wrote for 2 hours, filling 4 pages with the clear, precise, unassailable documentation of everything she had done, and why and when she was finished. The letter looked like something that could stand up in any court in the country. She handed it to Ethan to read before she sealed it. He read every word. This is good, he said. Is it thorough enough? Clara, if his lawyer reads this letter, he is going to tell your brother to find a different hobby. She sealed it and gave it to Pete to take to the post office the next morning. That evening on the porch, she sat in her chair the empty one that had waited a year for her, and said nothing for a long time. The Montana evening spread out in front of them, enormous and indifferent and somehow comforting. I used to think leaving was the selfish thing, she said finally. You were afraid of that. I was certain of it for years. She was quiet. But staying wouldn't have helped him. It would have just meant one more person in a failing situation pouring themselves into something that was going to fail anyway. Slower maybe, but fail. She looked at her hands. I was so careful. I documented everything. I trained someone to replace me. I arranged the accounts. I did everything right. You did, Ethan said. And he still found a way to make it feel like I did something wrong. That's what people like your brother do, Ethan said. They make you question whether your right thing was actually right. It's a particular skill, and it works on good people, because good people are always willing to consider that they might be wrong. She turned to look at him. How do you know about that? He was quiet a moment. Ruth, he said. The name cost him something small but real. The woman who left. Before she left, there was about a year where I spent most of my time wondering if the ways I was failing her were my fault or hers. She was very skilled at making both answers feel true simultaneously. He looked out at the land. It took me a long time to understand that someone can be genuinely hurt by a situation and still not be right about who is responsible for it. Clara said nothing for a long time. Then she said, I'm sorry that happened to you. It was 13 years ago. That doesn't mean it didn't cost you something. He turned to look at her. She was watching him with the same direct, assessing gaze she'd turned on him at the train platform, but something in it had changed. There was a different quality to it now. Less assessment. More recognition. It cost me a long time, he said, but I built something with the time, so I suppose it evened out. She looked at the house behind them, at the 2 chairs, at the land that ran out to the mountains. Yes, she said. I suppose it did. They sat on the porch until the last of the light was gone, and neither of them needed to fill the silence, and the silence for once felt like something rich rather than something empty. And Ethan Walker, for the first time in 13 years, felt the particular sensation of not being entirely alone in the life he had chosen. It was nothing like he had imagined it would be. It was considerably better. 3 weeks after Clara arrived, Thomas Caldwell made his first real move. It didn't look like a move at first. It looked like a social call. He rode up to the ranch on a Thursday afternoon when Ethan was out checking the north fence line, and Clara was alone in the house, working through a set of supply contracts she had offered to review for the Hendersons, a neighboring farm family, who had been consistently underpaid for their grain for 2 seasons running. Clara had noticed this the way she noticed all financial irregularities, not by looking for it, but because a mind trained on numbers sees imbalance the way a musician hears a wrong note. It is not a choice, it simply happens. She heard the horse. She came to the door. Thomas Caldwell was dressed well as he always was, and he removed his hat when he saw her, which was the correct thing to do. And he smiled the way men smile when they have decided in advance what they want the interaction to accomplish. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I don't believe we've been formally introduced. I'm Thomas Caldwell. I have land north of Ethan's property." "I know who you are," Clara said. Something flicked across his expression. Not offense recalibration. "I wanted to come by and welcome you to the valley," he said. "It's not an easy place for someone from the city. I thought it might be useful to have a neighbor introduce himself, who could answer questions without—" He paused delicately, the particular perspective of someone who's already decided how things should be. Clara looked at him with the same expression she used on suppliers who had buried unfavorable terms in contract language and were waiting to see if she'd caught them. "That's a very careful way of suggesting that Ethan has given me a biased view of the valley," she said pleasantly. Thomas smiled. "I only meant—" "I know what you meant," she said in the same pleasant tone. "Mr. Caldwell, I spent 6 years in business in Boston. In that time, I dealt with a particular kind of man who comes to introduce himself with one hand while checking to see what's in your pocket with the other." She let that sit for exactly 1 second. "You're welcome to come inside for coffee if you'd like a genuine conversation. But if you came to tell me something that's intended to make me doubt the man I came here to be with, I'd suggest saving yourself the ride." Thomas stared at her. He hadn't expected that. Nobody had told him that Clara Whitmore from Boston would be standing in that doorway like someone who had been reading his mail. "I see Ethan wrote you about me," he said, and his voice had lost some of its polish. "He told me you wanted his land and that you'd be cordial to my face," she said. "He also told me you'd find a way to work against us. So far you're tracking exactly as described." Thomas put his hat back on. "You're making an enemy you don't need," he said, and the pleasantness was fully gone now. "I didn't make anything," Clara said. "You arrived that way. Good afternoon, Mr. Caldwell." She went back inside and closed the door. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, breathing steadily, listening to the sound of his horse moving away from the property. Then she went back to the Hendersons' contracts, found the clause she had been looking for, marked it in pencil, and kept working. When Ethan came in that evening and she told him what had happened, he sat down at the kitchen table and listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "You sent him away." "Was I wrong to—" "No," he said. "You were exactly right." He paused. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine. He's not the first man who thought a woman would be easier to manage than she turned out to be." She looked up from the contracts. "But Ethan, he's going to do something now. People like him don't absorb embarrassment quietly. He came here expecting to find someone uncertain, and instead found someone who knew his strategy before he deployed it. That's going to make him angry." "I know." "So what does he do when he's angry?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. "He uses money and connections to make things difficult. He controls a significant portion of the valley's water rights on the north side. He has relationships with the territorial land office that he's leveraged before." His voice was steady, but his jaw was tight. "He shut down the Miller family's operation 2 years ago, not directly, through paperwork, through delays at the land office, through making everything just difficult enough that they couldn't sustain it." Clara absorbed this. "Does he have any claim against your property?" "Not currently." "Not currently," she repeated. "What would give him one?" Ethan looked at her. "There's a survey dispute from 1879. A corner post on the east boundary was documented in 2 different places in 2 different records. It's never been formally resolved because it didn't matter. Neither party was contesting anything. But if someone pushed it through the land office, it becomes a contest," Clara said. "Yes. Do you have the original survey documents? In the box in the study. I have both records. She was already pushing back from the table. Show me. He showed her. She spent 2 hours with the documents that evening, reading everything with the concentration she applied to anything that mattered, asking Ethan questions every 20 minutes that got progressively more specific, and that he answered as accurately as he could. By the time she was finished, she had made 3 pages of notes in her compact, precise handwriting. The 1879 record is the problem, she said. But the 1882 resurvey supersedes it. If someone at the land office were looking for a reason to question your boundary, they'd use the 1879 document and ignore the 1882 one. The question is whether you have anyone at the land office who would look at both. I know the registrar, Ethan said. Harold Beck. He's a decent man, but he's cautious and he responds to authority. If Thomas's family applied pressure, then we need to get there before Thomas does, Clara said. Ethan looked at her across the kitchen table, the survey documents between them, the lamp casting steady light across her focused face. We, he said. She looked up. Something moved in her expression, not quite surprise, more like recognition. Yes, she said. We. Is that all right? It's more than all right, he said. I'm just not used to it. I know, she said. Get used to it. They went to the land office in the county seat on a Monday, and they went together. Pete handled the ranch for the day, doing so with the particular competence of a young man who understood that some things mattered and needed to be handled correctly. He asked no questions about where they were going, which Ethan appreciated. Clara wore her Boston clothes, which were different from what she wore around the ranch. More formal, more deliberate. The clothing of a woman who had spent years walking into rooms where people assumed she was less than she was, and had learned to use appearance as the first argument. Ethan noticed this and said nothing about it because it did not require comment. Harold Beck, at the land office, was a thin, careful man in his mid-50s, who took his position seriously in the way that small jurisdiction officials sometimes do, with a thoroughness that was either deeply principled or deeply self-protective, and in Harold's case was probably both. He greeted Ethan with the familiar courtesy of 2 men who had done business over years. He greeted Clara with the more uncertain courtesy of someone who wasn't sure what category she occupied. Clara solved that immediately. She opened the document case she had brought, laid both survey records on Harold's desk in chronological order, and said, Mr. Beck, I want to draw your attention to the relationship between these 2 documents and ensure the current register reflects the correct precedents. Harold looked at the documents. He looked at Clara. He looked at Ethan. The 1882 survey, Harold said carefully, which supersedes the 1879 record under Territorial Survey Law, Section 4, Paragraph 2, Clara said. I've brought a copy of the relevant statutory language if you'd like to verify. She had brought a copy of the relevant statutory language. Ethan had not known this until that moment. Harold Beck spent the next 40 minutes going through both documents with a thoroughness that was at first professional and became increasingly respectful as Clara answered every question he raised before he finished raising it. She knew the documents better than Ethan did. She knew the law that governed them better than the land office registrar did. When it was done, Harold made a notation in the register, stamped both documents, and said, The 1882 survey is the record of precedence. I'll note that in the file. I'd appreciate a copy of that notation, Clara said. Of course, Harold said, and went to make one immediately, which was not something Harold Beck did immediately for most people. When they were outside, Ethan said, You brought the statutory language. I found it in the Territorial Law volume at the county library on Saturday, she said. I rode there and back while you were checking the south pasture. He looked at her. You did that without telling me. I didn't know if it would be relevant until I read it, she said. I don't report preliminary research. He stopped walking. Clara. She turned to look at him. Thank you, he said. She seemed mildly surprised by the directness of it. We needed the paperwork. I know. That's not what I'm thanking you for. He held her gaze. I've been running this ranch alone for 15 years. I've handled problems alone, made decisions alone, carried everything alone, because that's all there was." He paused. "And you've been here 3 weeks, and you rode to the county library on a Saturday on your own because you saw a problem I hadn't fully assessed yet, and you got ahead of it, without asking permission, without waiting to be told." She was watching him carefully. "That is what a partner does," he said. "I don't think I understood what that actually looked like until right now." Something crossed her face, not the brisk competence she wore when she was working, not the careful directness she'd brought to difficult conversations, but something quieter and less armored. "My brother used to say, I overstepped," she said. "That I took over. That I didn't know how to let other people lead." "He was wrong," Ethan said. "You know exactly how to let other people lead. You just also know when they need help, and you don't pretend not to know that to make them comfortable." She was quiet for a moment. "You're the first person who has ever said that to me," she said. "It's true." "I know," she said. "That's why it matters." They drove back to the ranch, and the road was long, and they talked the whole way, not about Thomas Caldwell, or survey records or land law, but about smaller things, the kind of things that don't seem significant until you realize they are the substance of an actual shared life. What Pete's plans for his future might be. What Clara thought about the Henderson family's situation and whether there was a workable solution to their grain pricing problem. Whether the reading corner needed another shelf, now that Clara had unpacked her books and discovered there were more of them than either had fully anticipated. Clara had a great many books. Ethan had built 4 shelves. "I thought 4 would be generous," he said. "It was generous for a normal person," she said. "How many did you bring?" 73. He stared at the road ahead of them. "I'll build more shelves. I was going to ask." "Consider it asked and answered," she laughed. Really laughed. The unself-conscious sound of someone caught genuinely off guard by something funny, and the sound of it did something to Ethan's chest that he had no formal language for and didn't try to name. The letter from Boston arrived 4 days later. It was from Clara's father's attorney, the response to James Whitmore's legal claim. The attorney, a methodical man named Arthur Pennick, who had handled the Whitmore family's legal affairs for 20 years, had reviewed everything Clara sent and responded with a 4-sentence letter that was in its economy and precision a minor masterpiece of legal dismissal. The claim had no legal foundation. The transactions were properly authorized and documented. He had communicated this to James's attorney. The matter was closed. Clara read the letter at the kitchen table and set it down very carefully. Ethan watched her face. She was working through something. "My brother backed down," she said. "Yes. He always backs down when it costs him something." She was quiet. "He spent money hiring that lawyer. He did it to frighten me, and when he found out it wouldn't work, he folded." She looked at the letter. "He's never going to change." "No," Ethan said. "And my father is going to keep defending him because that's what my father does, even when he knows better." She looked up. "That's the part I have to make peace with, not James. James is what he is. But my father choosing to love someone the way he does, even when that person doesn't deserve it, I can't change that either." "No," Ethan said again. "I used to think if I did everything right, if I was capable enough and reliable enough and stayed long enough, the situation would eventually become fair," she said. "I've known for years that's not true, but knowing it and feeling it are different things." Ethan came to sit across from her. "What do you need right now?" She looked at him. The question seemed to catch her off guard, not because it was complicated, but because it was simple in a way she wasn't accustomed to. "I think I just needed to say it to someone who would hear it, without telling me I'm wrong to feel it," she said. "You're not wrong," he said. "I know, but it helps to hear it from someone else." "Then hear it again," he said. "You are not wrong." She looked at him for a moment that felt longer than it was. "Ethan, can I ask you something direct?" "Yes." "What is this between us? Because we have not named it, And I think we both know it has become something, and I would rather we said what it is than kept moving around the edges of it." He had not expected the question in that moment in those words with that directness. But he should have. He should have expected it because it was exactly like her. "I think it has been something for 8 months," he said. "Before you got here. Before I knew what you looked like, or how you laughed, or that you owned 73 books. He held her gaze. "I think I was building this house for someone I had already decided to love. I just hadn't admitted it yet because I was afraid of what it meant to admit it." The kitchen was very quiet. "I'm not afraid of it," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I've been afraid of a great many things in my life. I am not afraid of this." "Neither am I," he said. "Not anymore." She nodded once, a small and definite movement. "Good," she said. "Then we know what it is." Shag. 3 days after that, Thomas Caldwell took his second shot, and this one was considerably less polite than the first. A man named Silas Webb appeared at the ranch on a Wednesday morning. Silas was a land surveyor by trade and by reputation, a man who found what clients hired him to find. He presented Ethan with a formal notice of survey dispute filed through the county land office, contesting the eastern boundary of the Walker property on the basis of the 1879 survey record. Ethan read the notice with the steadiness of a man who had been half expecting it and handed it to Clara without speaking. She read it in 90 seconds. "He filed before he knew about Monday," she said. "Yes." "Harold Beck is going to have to respond to this with the notation he made Monday." "Yes. Thomas doesn't know that yet." She set the notice down. "He spent money on this. He set this in motion before he knew we'd already closed the door." She looked at Ethan. "He's going to be very angry when he finds out." "I know." "Angry men make mistakes," she said. "Sometimes." "In my experience always," she said. "The question is whether we're in position to use the mistake when he makes it." Pete appeared in the doorway. He had seen the surveyor arrive and had been hovering with the respectful anxiety of someone who understands that some moments require proximity without intrusion. "What do you need?" Pete asked. "Ride to Harold Beck's office," Ethan said. "Tell him Silas Webb just filed a survey dispute on our eastern boundary. Tell him we'll be there tomorrow morning." Pete was gone in under 3 minutes. Clara was already at the desk pulling out the copy of Harold's notation from Monday, and the copy of the 1882 survey, and the statutory language from the territorial law volume, and the original survey dispute notice, and organizing them in the particular way she organized things when the stakes were high by argument sequence, not by date, the order in which a case is built, rather than the order in which documents were created. "You're not afraid," Ethan said. She looked up briefly. "No, are you?" "No," he said, and realized that was true, that somewhere in the past 3 weeks, a fear he had been carrying for 15 years, the fear that everything he built could be taken from him by someone with more money and more connections and more willingness to fight dirty, had changed shape. It was still present. But it was no longer paralyzing because for the first time in 15 years, he was not carrying it alone. "Ethan," Clara said without looking up from the documents, "when this is resolved, and it will be resolved, I want to talk to you about the Henderson family's grain situation. Because what Thomas is doing to you, someone has been doing to them on a smaller scale for 2 years, and I think we can fix it." He looked at her. "One thing at a time." "I can manage 2 things at a time," she said. "I know you can," he said. "I'm asking you to let me keep up." She looked up then. Something warm moved through her expression. "Fair enough," she said. "One thing at a time." They were at Harold Beck's office the next morning at 8 o'clock sharp, with every document ordered and every argument prepared, and what followed was 2 hours of the most methodical legal dismantling Ethan had ever witnessed. Harold Beck, faced with the Monday notation, the 1882 survey precedents, the statutory language, and Clara's absolute command of every relevant detail, had no choice but to respond to the survey dispute with the information now correctly on record. Which meant Thomas Caldwell's filing landed on a registrar who already had in front of him the legal reason to dismiss it. Harold drafted the dismissal response that morning. When they walked out, Ethan said, "That's it." "That's it," Clara said. "For this. He may try something else. But not this. Not this." He stopped walking. She stopped beside him and looked at him, waiting. "I've been fighting this man's influence on my own for 4 years," Ethan said. "Every time he pushed, I just held ground and hoped. I didn't know how to push back." "You know how to hold ground," she said. "That matters. The ground has to be worth holding before you can push back from it." He looked at her. "You changed something." "We changed something," she said. He took one breath and then said with the directness of a man who has decided to stop moving around the edges of important things, "Clara, I want to do this right. I want to ask you properly. Not because it's the arrangement we agreed to, because I have spent 3 weeks discovering that the woman I built that house for is exactly the woman I hoped she would be, and considerably more. And I would like if you're willing to make this permanent." She went very still, not uncertain. Still. The way a person goes still when they're feeling something that deserves that kind of attention. "Are you asking me to marry you?" she said. "Yes," he said. She was quiet for a long moment, and he waited because it was a question that deserved actual consideration, and he would not shortchange it by being impatient. Then she said, "I came here not knowing what I'd find. I told myself I was making a reasonable decision based on evidence from 8 months of letters. I told myself I was not being romantic, I was being practical." A pause. "I was lying to myself." "Were you?" "I was hoping," she said. "I hadn't let myself hope for something in a very long time, and I was hoping so hard it scared me, and so I told myself I was being practical instead." She looked at him directly the way she always looked at him all the way through, no flinching. "Yes, Ethan, I'll marry you." He exhaled a breath he had been holding without realizing it. She held out her hand, not romantically, but with the solid, real gesture of a woman who makes agreements she intends to keep. He took it. And standing in front of the county land office in the Montana Territory morning, with Harold Beck's dismissal paperwork sitting on a desk 20 feet behind them, and Thomas Caldwell's failed legal maneuver dissolving quietly in the files, Ethan Walker held Clara Whitmore's hand for the first time, and felt the specific, irreversible sensation of his life shifting permanently onto a new foundation. One that was going to hold. Margaret Hayes cried at the wedding. She would have denied it strenuously if anyone had said so directly. But Ethan saw it, and Clara saw it, and Pete Dawson saw it, and was wise enough to look away immediately. The ceremony was small. The Valley's circuit preacher, a handful of neighbors, Margaret in her good dress, Pete with his hat in his hands, and it took place on the front porch of the house Ethan had built in front of the 2 chairs that had waited a year for exactly this moment. Clara wore a dress she had brought from Boston, dark blue, practical enough to be real, and fine enough to be the occasion. She had not told Ethan about it in any letter. He saw it for the first time when she came through the front door and down the porch steps, and his entire chest did the thing it had been doing since the train platform. The compression and release that he was slowly accepting was simply what it felt like to be near her. The preacher read the words. They said the words back. When it was done, Margaret grabbed both of Clara's hands and said, "You are exactly what I hoped for, and I hoped very specifically." Clara smiled at her. "He wrote me about you. Every time he mentioned you, I thought I want to know that woman." "You were right to want that," Margaret said with zero humility and complete sincerity, and Clara laughed that real, unguarded laugh that Ethan had been storing up without meaning to, the one that still surprised him slightly each time it happened. Pete shook Ethan's hand with the solemnity of a young man who understood the weight of the moment. "Congratulations, Mr. Walker." "Pete," Ethan said. "After 5 years of working together, I think you can call me Ethan." Pete considered this. "Maybe," he said. "Give me some time." The small gathering ate Margaret's cooking, which was considerably better than anything Ethan would have produced, and the afternoon had that particular quality of right occasions, unhurried warm too soon over. When the guests were gone and the porch was quiet again, Ethan and Clara sat in their 2 chairs as the Montana evening settled around them, and Clara said, "It's real now." "It was real before," Ethan said. "It was real," she agreed. "But now it's official. Different things." "How so?" She thought about it. "Before I was still holding the door slightly open, the way you do when you're not entirely certain you won't need to leave. Not because I planned to, but because I've always had one hand on the door." She looked at him. "I don't have that anymore. I closed the door." He turned to look at her fully. "When did that happen?" She didn't hesitate. "Outside the land office," she said. "When you asked me to marry you and I realized I was going to say yes before you finished the sentence." He was quiet a moment. "You made me wait," he said. "You deserved a proper answer," she said. "Not a reflex." The first season of their marriage taught them things about each other that letters never could. Clara learned that Ethan was at his worst before 6 in the morning and his best in the middle of the afternoon, that he processed difficult feelings through physical work, the way other people process them through conversation, and that the best way to know something was genuinely bothering him was when he went very quiet, rather than quiet in his ordinary way, a distinction she learned to recognize with some precision. Ethan learned that Clara could not tolerate financial injustice of any scale, that she argued hardest about the things she was most uncertain about, and that when she was frightened, genuinely frightened, not just anxious, she became extremely methodical, as though organization were a form of prayer. They argued. They always came back, not always quickly, not always gracefully, but consistently. The way Margaret had said was the only thing that mattered. What they built together in those first months was something neither had experienced before, a daily life where two people's strengths covered each other's gaps, without either person needing to become smaller to make room. Clara reorganized the ranch's financial structure from the ground up. Not dramatically, not by replacing what Ethan had built, but by making it more legible, more defensible, more capable of growth. She renegotiated 4 supplier contracts in the first season. She identified a market for early season beef that Ethan had not known existed through a contact she made by writing a letter to a cattle broker in Helena, entirely on her own initiative. She helped the Henderson family resolve their grain pricing situation, which turned out to involve a middleman who had been quietly skimming for 3 years, and who found himself faced one October morning with Clara Whitmore Walker's documentation and the suggestion that he might want to make things right before she involved the county. He made things right. Word traveled. The way things traveled in the valley through the invisible network of community that connected every household to every other carried in the small commerce of daily life. People began to understand that Clara Walker was not a city woman who had survived her first season in Montana. She was a woman who was actively reshaping the economic landscape of Silver Creek Valley, quietly, methodically, one ledger and one contract and one corrected injustice at a time. Ellen Pratt told her husband. She came here for Ethan and stayed for the rest of us. Her husband said, I don't think that's quite right. Ellen said, then what is? He thought about it. She came here for herself. The rest of us are just lucky she chose this valley. Thomas Caldwell's third move came in November, and it was the one that could have ended everything. He didn't come at them through the land office this time. He was smarter than that. He had learned from the first 2 failures, or rather, he had learned from Clara in the sense that watching someone consistently outmaneuver you eventually teaches you where they're strong and where they're not. He went after Pete. Specifically, Thomas offered Pete Dawson a foreman position on the Caldwell operation at twice the salary Ethan was paying, with a house of his own and a stake in the future profits. It was a genuine offer, a good offer, the kind that a 22-year-old without much family money would be a fool to refuse on purely financial terms. Pete came to Ethan on a Friday evening and told him about it directly, which said everything about what kind of person Pete was. He offered me foreman, Pete said. Ethan was at his workbench. He set down what he was holding. Wow, Wednesday. I've been thinking about it since. That's fair, Ethan said. It's a real offer. It's real. Good money, house on the property. Pete looked at him steadily. And I think he made it because he knew what losing me would do to your operation going into winter. Yes, Ethan said. I think so too. So I wanted to tell you before I gave him an answer, because you should know what he's doing. I appreciate that, Ethan said. He was quiet for a moment. Pete, what do you want to do? Pete seemed surprised by the directness of the question. I want to know if you can match it. I can't match the salary right now. The house... He paused. There's the old Hendricks cabin on the south edge of the property. It needs work. 2 weeks of work, but it's solid. He looked at Pete. I'm not going to tell you to stay out of loyalty. That's not a fair thing to ask. But here's what I can tell you honestly. What's being built on this ranch right now is not what it was 6 months ago, and in 2 years, what it will be is something I'd want a stake in. Are you offering me a stake? Ethan hadn't fully decided that until he said the next words. Yes. 10% of net profit from the cattle operation starting at the end of next season, reviewed annually. And the cabin. Pete looked at him for a long moment. That's not nothing, Pete said. No, Ethan said. It isn't. Pete was quiet. Then he said, he was counting on me not telling you. He figured I'd just take it and you'd find out when I was gone. I know. He doesn't understand how this place works, Pete said. There was something definitive in his voice, the sound of a decision arriving. All right, the cabin and the stake. I'm staying. Ethan nodded. Go look at the cabin this weekend. Make a list of what it needs. We'll start on it Monday. When Pete left, Ethan found Clara in the study and told her everything. She listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she said, the stake was the right call. I know. I should have offered it before. You didn't have reason to before. Now you do. She looked at him. And Thomas is going to find out by the end of the week that Pete stayed. That's the 3rd time we've closed a door he tried to open. And men like Thomas don't take 3 failures quietly, she said. He's going to try something different, something we haven't thought of. She was right. She was almost always right about these things, and Ethan had learned to trust that without needing to understand it completely. Clara read people the way she read ledgers, not the numbers they wanted to show you, but the story the numbers told whether they meant to or not. The something different came 2 weeks later, and it was the worst of everything Thomas had tried. He went to Clara's brother James. No one knew exactly how Thomas found James Whitmore or what was said between them. But in late November, a man arrived in Silver Creek Valley, who Clara had not expected to see, and who Ethan had never met James Whitmore himself in person from New York, carrying a briefcase, and the particular expression of a man who has decided to frame self-interest as family concern. He came to the ranch on a Tuesday morning unannounced. Clara heard the knock and opened the door and went absolutely still for 1 full second. Then she said, James. He said, Clara, you look well. She did not move from the doorway. What are you doing here? I came to see you, he said, and to discuss a situation that has come to my attention regarding father's affairs. Ethan appeared at Clara's shoulder. He had heard the voice and the name and come immediately. James looked at him. You must be Walker. I am, Ethan said. James looked between them and then back at Clara with the expression of a man who is recalculating. He had expected Ethan understood immediately to find his sister alone. He had expected to find her in a situation that could be presented as uncertain, isolating, regrettable. He had expected to arrive as a rescue and be received as one. He found instead 2 people standing together in a doorway, shoulder to shoulder, with the particular quiet solidity of people who have been tested and have not broken. Come in, Clara said finally, and her voice was completely level. But understand that whatever you want to say to me, you say in front of my husband. James sat at the kitchen table and explained himself, and it took about 10 minutes for the full picture to emerge. Thomas Caldwell had contacted him, had described with considerable creative embellishment the difficulties of Clara's situation in Montana, The isolation, the hardship, the legal disputes, the uncertainty of Ethan's financial position. Had suggested very carefully that a concerned family member might want to investigate whether Clara had made her decision under full information, and had apparently offered James a finder's fee, framed as compensation for his time and trouble, if James could persuade Clara to return to Boston. Clara heard all of this without changing expression. Ethan watched her hands, which were flat on the table and perfectly still. When James finished, she said, "He paid you to come here." "He offered to reimburse my expenses," James said, "which is not the same." "He paid you to come here," Clara said again, "and tell me that my life is a mistake, and you came." James's jaw tightened. "I came because I'm your brother and I'm concerned." "You're not concerned," she said. "If you were concerned, you would have come in the 14 months I was alone managing Father's business. You would have come when I wrote you that winter and told you the accounts were in crisis. You would have come any of the dozens of times a concerned brother might reasonably appear." Her voice was still level, still controlled, but there was iron under every word. "You came now because someone gave you a financial reason to, and I want you to hear me clearly. James, I am not going back to Boston. I am not leaving this ranch. I am not leaving my husband. And whatever Thomas Caldwell paid you for this errand, it was money he wasted." James looked at Ethan. "Walker, surely you can see that your wife—" "My wife," Ethan said, "has just told you her position. I have nothing to add to it, except that it is also mine." James looked between them again. The calculation was visible on his face, not shame, not quite, but the recognition of a man who has arrived at a situation that will not yield the way he expected. "Clara," he said, and his voice shifted slightly, became something that might have been genuine under different circumstances. "I did come because of Caldwell. That's true. But I also— Father is not well. He's been asking for you." The kitchen went quiet. Clara's hands on the table moved just slightly. Ethan watched her absorb this information, watched her face go through something private and complicated that cost her something real. "How bad?" she said. "The doctor says before spring," James said quietly. The silence stretched. Then Clara said, "I'll write to him today. A real letter. Not the careful letters, a real one." She looked at her brother. "And James, if you want a relationship with me, it will have to be one you build honestly. Not through people who want to use you against me. Not through manufactured concern. Honestly, I am here. This is my life. You are welcome in it if you come as my brother and not as someone else's instrument." James left 2 hours later without his finder's fee and without whatever outcome Thomas Caldwell had purchased him to deliver. Ethan waited until the sound of the horse was gone and then said, "Are you all right?" Clara was at the window. "My father is dying," she said. "Yes. I knew it was coming. That doesn't make it—" She stopped. "I need a minute." "Take what you need." She stood at the window for a long time. He stayed in the kitchen close enough to be present far enough to give her the space she was asking for, because he had learned that about her, that grief for Clara needed room to be itself before it needed company. After a while she came to the table and sat down, and he sat across from her. "I'm going to write him a true letter," she said. "Not the ones I've been writing. The careful, reassuring ones. A true one." "Yes," Ethan said. "And then whatever happens, I'll know I told him what was real." "Do you want me to leave you to write it?" "No," she said immediately. "Stay." She looked at him with the directness that had been the first thing about her that felt like coming home. "I've been in this room with you long enough that you being here helps me think." He stayed. She wrote the letter that afternoon, 4 pages, and she read none of it aloud, and he asked no questions, and when she sealed it, she said, "Thank you. I didn't do anything." "You stayed," she said. That was the thing. Thomas Caldwell's operation began to decline in December, not because of anything Ethan or Clara did directly, because of what they had built. The ranchers and farm families in Silver Creek Valley had been watching all of it. The land office dispute, the Pete situation, James Whitmore's visit, all of it absorbed into the community's collective understanding of what was happening. And what people understood the way communities understand things was that Thomas Caldwell had tried 3 times to bring down the Walker Ranch and had failed 3 times, and that the woman Ethan Walker had built a house for had turned out to be the single most capable financial mind in the valley. 3 families quietly moved their supply contracts. 2 ranchers who had been doing business with the Caldwell operation on disadvantageous terms they hadn't known were disadvantageous, until Clara over autumn dinners and front porch conversations had gently pointed out the discrepancies, renegotiated, or moved on. A grain cooperative that Clara had been helping organize through the winter formalized itself in January and immediately undercut the pricing structure the Caldwell interests had depended on. Thomas came to Ethan one February morning, and Ethan saw him coming and went out to meet him at the gate, the way you meet a thing before it reaches your house. Thomas looked older than he had in the summer. Not defeated, not exactly, but recalibrated in the way that men recalibrate when the world has not yielded to them the way they assumed it would. "Walker," he said. "Caldwell. I want to say something without it becoming a confrontation." "Then say it," Ethan said. "I underestimated what you were building here," Thomas said, "and I underestimated your wife." He paused. "That is not an apology. I did what I thought was right for my operation, but I am telling you that I know when something is settled." Ethan looked at him for a moment. "Is it settled?" "I'm not coming after your land again," Thomas said. "It's not worth what it costs." "No," Ethan agreed. "It isn't." Thomas nodded once and rode away, and Ethan stood at the gate and watched him go, and felt something he hadn't expected to feel. Not triumph, not vindication, but a kind of quiet, tired completion. He went inside and told Clara. She listened and was quiet for a moment and then said, "Is it over?" "I think so." "Good," she said, and went back to the cooperative paperwork she had been working on, because that was Clara. She did not linger in victories. She moved to the next thing always because there was always a next thing, and the next thing was also worth doing. Clara's father died in March. The letter from Arthur Pennock arrived on a Thursday, and Clara read it at the kitchen table, and Ethan sat with her, and she cried in the way she did everything directly, without performance, without apology for feeling what she felt. He held her hands across the table and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would help, and he understood by now that she did not need him to say things. She needed him to be there. She was there. That was the whole of it. James wrote 2 weeks later. A short letter, nothing like the man who had appeared in their kitchen in November. He wrote that their father had spoken of Clara in his final weeks more than he had spoken of almost anything. That he had kept her letters, all of them, the careful ones and the true one, in the drawer of his bedside table. That he had told James 2 days before he died, "Your sister found the right life. Don't you make trouble for it." James had written those words, and then written below them, "I won't." Clara read that letter twice, and then folded it carefully and put it in the box on the study shelf next to the pressed flower from her mother's garden, and 63 letters from a man in Montana she had decided to trust before she had any right to be certain. "He kept them," she said. "Of course he did," Ethan said. "I wasn't sure he read them." "Fathers read everything," Ethan said. "They just don't always say so." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm glad I wrote the true one." "So am I." She looked at him. "You told me to." "I suggested it," he said. "You decided. Stop being gracious. Stop giving me credit I don't deserve." She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. Spring came, and with it, something new. Clara was pregnant. She told Ethan on a Thursday morning in April, matter-of-factly, as though announcing something she had verified to her own satisfaction and was now reporting. He stared at her for a moment, and then did something she had not seen him do before he sat down heavily in the nearest chair, with the expression of a man whose capacity for organized thought had temporarily departed. "Ethan," she said. He looked up. "Say something," she said. He stopped. "I'm trying to..." He stopped again. "You're not a man who loses words," she said. I'm losing them right now, he admitted. She came and sat beside him, which was what she did when she was feeling something too large for distance. Are you happy? She asked directly, because that was always how she asked. He took her hand. Clara, I built a house for a person I had never met. I waited a year. I wrote more letters than I had written in my entire life. I fought a land dispute and a survey challenge and a bought and paid for family visit. He looked at her. And the whole time underneath all of it, the thing I wanted most, the thing I didn't even let myself say out loud because it seemed like wanting too much, was exactly this. A life that was full, a life that was real. He tightened his hand around hers. Yes, I'm happy. I'm the happiest I have ever been, and I don't have words for it right now. She leaned her head against his shoulder, which was not something she did often. Clara was not a person who leaned, and he understood that it meant something specific, that she was letting herself be held the way she very rarely allowed, and he held very still, so the moment could be exactly what it was. We're going to need more bookshelves, she said. He laughed, the real full surprised kind that she still occasionally startled out of him. We'll build them, he said. We will, she said. Mo. Margaret Hayes sat on the Walker porch that June in the early evening watching the light move over the land. Ethan and Clara were inside some combination of cooking and arguing about cooking that had become one of their reliable routines. Pete was across the property, working on the expansion of the cabin he now called home. Somewhere in the valley, a grain cooperative meeting was being organized by 3 families whose situations had improved measurably in the past year. Margaret sat in the chair that had waited a year for Clara and listened to the voices inside the house. Not the words, just the sound of 2 people existing in the same space, with the easy friction of people who know each other deeply and have stopped pretending they don't. She thought about the morning Ethan had come to her kitchen and let her convince him to place an advertisement. She thought about the way he had looked when she'd said the word lonely, and he had not denied it. She thought about watching him build this house board by board in the cold and the heat, in the long months when no letters had arrived yet and no guarantee existed that any would. She thought about Clara stepping off that train with 2 heavy suitcases, and immediately assessing the situation with those dark, direct eyes. The voices inside rose briefly and then settled into laughter. Margaret smiled. The house was full. The chairs were full. The land that Ethan Walker had tended alone for 15 years now held the sounds of 2 people who had found each other across 8 months of honest letters and had decided every day since to keep choosing what they'd started. The lonely cowboy had built a house for a bride he'd never met, and the woman who'd arrived with 2 suitcases and 73 books had walked through the door, looked at everything he'd built, and understood immediately that he had not been building a house at all. He had been building an argument that love prepared for with patience and built with honesty will find its way to the door you left open. And he had been right.